Day my daughter-in-law stood on my front porch, raised a glass of champagne toward the neighbors, and shouted, "He's finally gone." That was the day I realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But let me back up, because the ending only makes sense if you understand how it started. My name is Harold. No, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. People call me Ned. Edward Baxter, 63 years old, retired electrician out of Columbus, Ohio. I spent 31 years crawling through attics and digging trenches in the Ohio cold so that I could own one thing free and clear before I died: my house on Clover Mill Road. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage I converted into a workshop, and a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden that my late wife Barbara planted the spring before she passed. The tomatoes still come back every year. I never touch them, I just let them grow. I'm not a complicated man. I never needed much. After Barbara died, I kept the house clean, cooked my own meals, watched the Browns lose every Sunday like it was a religious obligation, and I was, if not happy, then at least steady. There is something underrated about being steady. My son Philip moved back to Columbus about 4 years ago with his wife Renee. No, not Renee. Her name was Darla. Darla Baxter, née Hutchins, from Macon, Georgia, with a voice like sweet tea and eyes that could talk you into or out of anything depending on which direction she pointed them. I liked her at first. I want to be honest about that. I liked her. Philip had been living out in Phoenix for about 6 years, working in logistics. He met Darla out there, married her in a small ceremony I flew out for, and for a while they seemed fine. Then the company he worked for restructured, that word that really means they cut people loose, and Philip called me one Sunday evening and said, "Dad, we're in a tight spot." I said, "How tight?" He said, "We might lose the apartment." I didn't hesitate. I said, "Come home. You can stay here until you get back on your feet. I got the room. I got the space. Come home." I said it like it was the easiest thing in the world. I said it the way you do when you love your kid and you genuinely believe that the people he loves will treat you with the same decency you're extending to them. I was 60 years old and I still had things to learn. They arrived on a Thursday in October, a rental truck and 2 sedans, more stuff than I expected. Darla had a way of moving through a space that I can only describe as claiming it. She wasn't rude about it. Not at first. She would look at a room and say, "Oh, this is nice," and you'd feel the compliment land, and then 2 days later something would be different. A lamp moved, a rug replaced, the throw pillows on the couch Barbara picked out ended up in a black garbage bag in the garage without anyone asking me. I didn't say anything. They were guests. You give guests room to settle. But they weren't guests for long. Within the first month, Darla had reorganized the kitchen. My mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Fisherman" that my buddy Ray gave me for my 55th birthday, disappeared. When I asked, Darla said she'd put it in a box in the closet because she was creating a unified look. I nodded. I went and found the mug and put it back on the hook. The next morning, it was gone again. Philip was working again by then. He picked up a job managing a warehouse on the east side. And he wasn't home much. Long hours, early starts. I understood that. What I started to understand less was that every time Philip wasn't in the room, the temperature of the house changed. Not toward cold exactly. More like I became less visible. Darla had a friend, a woman named Stacy, who started coming over most afternoons. They would sit in the living room with their iced coffees and talk at a volume that made it clear they knew I was home and didn't particularly care. They knew I was home and didn't particularly care. I'd walk through and say hello, and sometimes Stacy would smile and sometimes she would just look at her phone. I started spending more time in my workshop by spring. So about 6 months in, Darla had started referring to the house as our place when she was on the phone. Our place has a great backyard. Our place has 3 bedrooms. I told Philip about it one evening when Darla was out, and he looked uncomfortable and said, "Dad, she just means the house we're all living in. Don't read into it." I let it go. I let a lot of things go that year. There was the time Darla's mother came to visit from Georgia for 2 weeks and took my bedroom, while I slept on an air mattress in the workshop because, as Darla explained it, Her mother had a bad back and the workshop had a concrete floor and wasn't really suitable. Now was it? I said I'd sleep in my own room and her mother could have Philip's room. Darla looked at me like I'd suggested something indecent. Philip told me to be patient. I was patient. Then summer came and Darla told me she wanted to convert my workshop into a home gym. She'd already priced out the equipment. She showed me a Pinterest board on her phone, foam flooring tiles and a wall mirror and a bench press that would go exactly where my workbench was. I looked at that workbench. I'd built half the furniture in this house on that bench. Barbara and I had refinished her grandmother's oak chest on that bench the Christmas before she got sick. I said no. It was the first time I'd said no clearly and directly since they moved in, and the way Darla looked at me when I said it told me something I should have understood sooner. The look wasn't angry. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of someone recalculating. That night I heard them arguing behind their bedroom door. I couldn't make out words, just tone. Philip's voice low and apologetic, Darla's voice sharp and rising. In the morning, Philip wouldn't meet my eyes at the coffee maker. Things shifted after that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a foundation cracks, invisible for a long time, and then suddenly the whole wall goes. Darla stopped speaking to me directly. She would say things to Philip in my presence as though I weren't there. Tell your father dinner is at 6. Ask your father if he's going to be using the driveway. Tell your father. Always tell your father. Like I was someone who needed to be managed rather than spoken to. I am 62 years old, I thought. I fought for this house. I buried my wife from this house. I brought my son home to this house. When had I become a visitor in it? The moment I remember most clearly happened on a Tuesday morning in August. I came downstairs early the way I always do, made my coffee and went to sit in the chair in the den, the recliner I've had for 15 years, the one that still has the indentation of my shape in the cushion. There was a decorative pillow on it, one of the new ones Darla had ordered online, cream-coloured, with a geometric pattern. I moved it and sat down. Darla came in 10 minutes later, saw me in the chair and said, "We don't really sit in here anymore. We've been using this as more of a display room." I said, "This is where I watch the news." She said, "I know, but it kind of ruins the aesthetic." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Barbara. I thought about the 31 years I'd spent running wire through crawl spaces so I could sit in this specific chair in this specific room and watch the morning news in peace. I said, "This is my house." She said, "I know that, Ed. I'm just saying." And she picked up the decorative pillow, put it back on the armrest I wasn't using, and walked out. I sat there with my coffee going cold, and I felt something shift inside me, not anger, resolve. But I wasn't ready yet. I still thought it would get better. I still believed my son would wake up. The day it ended, the day everything broke, started like any other. I had come in from the garden around noon and gone to the kitchen for some water. Darla was on the phone in the hallway, and she either didn't hear me come in or didn't care, because she kept talking. I heard her say, clear as anything, "No, we've basically taken over the whole place. He just kind of putters around. I give it another couple months and he'll probably just move to a retirement community or something. Old people always eventually just go." Old people always eventually just go. I set my glass down carefully. I walked to the back door. I stood in the yard for a while next to Barbara's tomato plants. Then I called my attorney, a man named Dave who I'd known since the boys in our neighbourhood played Little League together. I didn't go into everything that day. I just said, "Dave, I need to know where I stand on my property." He asked me a few questions and I answered them, and when we were done he said, "Ned, that house is yours, has been for 20 years. No one can change that without your signature." I said, "I know, I just needed to hear it." I didn't tell Philip or Darla about the call. 3 weeks later, Philip came to me with a document. He set it on the kitchen table while I was eating lunch, and he said, "Dad, Darla and I have been talking, and we think it would make sense to put both our names on the house. Just for financial security, you know, in case something happens to you." I looked at the document. It was a quitclaim deed. Already filled out, he just needed my signature. I looked up at my son. He was 41 years old and he couldn't quite hold my gaze. I said, "Who drafted this?" He said Darla's cousin was a paralegal. I said, "No." He said, "Dad." I said, "No, Philip, this is not happening." He pushed back. He said it was just practical, just planning ahead, that I wasn't getting younger. I told him if he was concerned about planning ahead, we could talk about a will which already existed and which he was already in, but that I would not sign over equity in my home to anyone. Not now. Not like this. He left the kitchen. That night the house was very quiet. It was 4 days later when things turned physical. I am not proud to say this happened. I am not proud that it came to this in my own kitchen with my own son. I was at the sink washing out a coffee cup, and Philip came in. I could tell by the sound of his footsteps that something was wrong, and he said, "You need to start thinking about what's fair here, Dad. Darla and I have invested a lot into this house." I said, "You've lived here rent-free for 18 months. He said, "We've improved the property." I said, "I didn't ask you to." He said a few things after that I won't repeat, and then he put his hand on my shoulder and shoved me, not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough that I had to grab the counter, hard enough that it was undeniable, hard enough that I stood there for a second just feeling the shock of it, because whatever I had believed about my son up until that moment, I had not believed he would put his hands on me. I turned around and looked at him. He had the grace to look ashamed, but he didn't apologize. I went upstairs. I packed a bag. I called Ray, my buddy who gave me the fishing mug, and I said I needed somewhere to stay for a few days, and he said, "Get over here right now." I drove to Ray's house without saying a word to anyone. The next morning, Ray drove me past my own house on the way to breakfast because I'd left my insurance cards in the desk in the den, and I needed them. We pulled up, and there were cars on the street I didn't recognize. Music coming from inside. And then Darla came out onto the porch. My porch, the one I repainted 3 summers ago, the one with the hanging basket Barbara used to put geraniums in. And she had a glass of something sparkling and she raised it toward the neighbor across the street and said loudly, like she wanted to be heard, "He's finally gone. We are free." Ray looked at me. I looked at my house. She didn't see the car. She was already going back inside, laughing. And she didn't see me sitting in the passenger seat watching her walk back through my front door. Ray said, "Ned, tell me you called Dave." I said, "I called Dave." Here is what I had been doing in the 3 weeks between that phone call and the moment Philip shoved me. I had been quiet, and I had been watching, and I had been building a file. I had taken photographs of alterations to the property made without permits. Darla had knocked out a section of the laundry room wall to install a new utility sink. No permit, no contract or license. I had a copy of the original deed. I had 18 months of no lease, no rent checks, no formal agreement of any kind. Dave said that in Ohio, without a lease, they were month-to-month tenants at will. I could issue a 30-day notice to vacate. He had the paperwork ready. We served them the following Monday morning. Darla answered the door. She looked at the papers. She looked at the process server. She looked past him at Dave's car idling at the curb, and then slowly at my face in the passenger window. She said something I couldn't hear through the glass. Her expression, though, that I could read just fine. She called Philip. There was a lot of back and forth over the next week. Philip called me cold and formal at first, then angry, then on the third call, something that sounded almost like the voice of the boy I used to drive to baseball practice. He said, "Dad, I don't know what happened to us." I said, "I do. You let someone convince you that what was mine was yours, and when I disagreed, you put your hands on me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. I said I appreciated that, and that I hoped he meant it, but that the 30-day notice stood. It was during that same week that the other thing came out. Dave had done some routine background work, the kind he always does, and he came to me with a look on his face that I can only describe as carefully neutral. He sat down across from me at Ray's kitchen table and he said, "Ned, I need to show you something." Darla Hutchins had been married before, not before Philip, during. The marriage in Phoenix had never been legally dissolved. There was a first husband in Macon, Georgia, a man named Gary Hutchins who, according to the public records Dave had pulled, had never signed divorce papers and in fact had no record of any divorce proceeding at all. Darla had simply moved to Arizona, changed her last name informally, and married my son in what appeared to be a legally void ceremony. My son had been living with a woman for 4 years, believing himself to be her husband, while she was still legally married to someone else in another state. I sat with that for a while. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired and sad, and I thought about Philip and what it was going to do to him when he found out. But he needed to find out. Dave made some calls. The information was passed along. I will not go into what happened between Philip and Darla after that, because it is not my story to tell, and because some of it is still painful to me in ways I don't fully understand. What I will say is that Darla was out of my house by the end of the 30 days. She left without most of the furniture she had brought in, because the furniture that had been there when they arrived, my furniture, Barbara's furniture, she had quietly listed on Facebook Marketplace and sold 3 pieces while I was at Ray's. I found the listings. Dave sent letters. 2 of the pieces were returned, 1 wasn't. Philip stayed another 2 weeks after Darla left. Not in the house, we weren't ready for that. He stayed at a friend's apartment on the north side. We met twice for coffee. The conversations were careful and uncomfortable, and real in a way that conversations between fathers and sons often aren't. He said he didn't know about the first marriage. I believe him. He said he had let things go too far and too long. I believe that too. He said he was ashamed of what happened in the kitchen. I told him that was the one he'd have to live with for a while. I came back to Clover Mill Road on a Thursday afternoon in October, exactly 2 years to the month from when they'd arrived. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a minute before going in. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just been inflating it in my head while I was gone. I walked through the rooms. Some things were different. Some things were gone. The decorative pillows were still on the recliner. I put them in a box in the garage. Then I made a pot of coffee in my mug, the world's okayest fisherman one, which I had found in the back of the pantry behind a bag of flour, and I sat in my chair and I turned on the news and I was, if not happy, then at least steady. There is something underrated about being steady. Barbara's tomatoes were still out back. They had kept growing through all of it, the way things do when you just leave them alone and let them be what they are. I picked a few that evening, standing there in the late October cold, and I brought them inside, and I set them on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the light hits in the morning. I don't know what comes next with Philip. I think we will find our way back to something, though it will not be the same shape as what we had before. Some things break clean, and some things break in ways that leave uneven edges, and you just have to learn to live with the seam. I am 63 years old. I have learned to live with seams. What I know is this. I was patient for too long, and I said yes when I should have said no, and I let small things slide until they became large things, and none of that is unique to me. I think a lot of people do the same. I think a lot of people end up guests in rooms they built with their own hands. But the house is mine. It was always mine, and I am home. I keep coming back to the tomatoes. That probably sounds strange, but it's the image that stays with me. Barbara's tomato plants growing through all of it, through every argument and every small humiliation and every night I spent on Ray's pull-out couch wondering how things had gotten so far from what they were supposed to be. Nobody tended them. Nobody watered them or staked them or did anything at all. They just kept growing because that's what they do when you leave them alone and let them be what they are. I think about that a lot now. There's a version of this story where I'm the cautionary tale, and honestly, for a while I was. I let things slide that I shouldn't have let slide. I said yes when I should have said no. I stayed quiet in rooms where I had every right to speak, in a house that had my name on the deed and my wife's fingerprints on the walls. I told myself I was being patient, being generous, being a good father, And some of that was true. But some of it was just easier than the alternative, and I knew the difference, and I chose easy anyway. That's not something I'm proud of, but I think it's worth being honest about, because I don't think I'm the only one who's done it. What I've come to understand is that kindness without clarity isn't really kindness. When I let Darla put my things in boxes without saying a word, I wasn't being gracious. I was teaching her that I could be moved. When I slept on an air mattress in my own workshop so her mother could have my room, I wasn't being accommodating. I was showing everyone in that house exactly how little I thought my own comfort mattered. Every time I let something go, I was writing a permission slip, and eventually they cashed every one of them. The intelligence to see what's happening around you only matters if you have the honesty to name it. I saw the pattern early. I understood what Darla was doing. The slow replacement of everything that was mine with everything that was hers, the way she spoke about the house, the way she moved through it. I'm not a stupid man, but seeing clearly and acting on what you see are two different things, and for too long I let the gap between them grow. What finally moved me was Philip's hand on my shoulder. Not because it hurt, it didn't, not physically, but because in that moment I understood that my silence had cost my son something too. I had let things go so long that he had learned, somewhere along the way, that this was acceptable, that his father was someone you could push. I don't blame him entirely for that. I played a part in it. Getting back up, packing that bag, calling Dave, building the file, serving the papers, none of that was revenge. It was just me finally acting like someone who believed he deserved to live in his own house. That sounds like a low bar. It shouldn't be a low bar, but there it is. Philip and I are finding our way back. It's slow and it's uneven, and some conversations are still harder than they should be. But he called me last Sunday, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. And when we hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet, and I thought, okay, we're going to be okay. The house is the same as it always was. The chair still fits me. The mug is back on its hook. And out in the backyard, the tomatoes are already starting to come in for the season. Some things, if you just leave them alone, will find their way back to what they're supposed to be.